Good evening, everyone. My name is Kellen MacBeth, and I'm president of Equality Arlington. I'd like to thank you all for joining our webinar tonight on Know Your Rights, LGBTQ plus protections under attack. Tonight we have guest speakers from ACLU of Virginia and Home of Virginia to talk about LGBTQ plus rights in Virginia, and also to talk about the federal landscape and the recent attacks and continuing attacks on especially the trans and non-binary community, and what that means for folks as they look to assert their rights and protect themselves from attack from political forces that are seeking to do them harm. So tonight we're going to do some quick introductions and then jump into some questions for our guest speakers. And then if we have enough time, we'll open it up to questions from our attendees. So with that, again, I want to thank everyone for joining this event. We have, as I said, a representative from the ACLU of Virginia, Wyatt Rolla, who is the senior transgender rights attorney since January of 2023. They've worked alongside on behalf of trans people across the Commonwealth, deploying litigation, policy, and community lawyering tools. Prior to the ACLU Virginia, Wyatt worked for 9 years with Virginia's Legal Aid Justice Center. Their work at LAJC initially focused on housing law, providing both individual legal representation and legal support to tenant organizations. In 2017, Wyatt shifted to LAJC Civil Rights and Racial Justice Program, where they developed campaigns to combat the criminalization of the poor, people of color, and far too many Virginians. They served as the interim legal director for SRRJ for over a year, including during the summer of 2020 when uprisings across the country forced a national reckoning regarding policing and mass incarceration. In their final year at LAJC, Wyatt coordinated and consulted on work intertwining organizing and legal tools as the senior movement attorney. They earned their BA from the College of William and Mary and their law degree from the University of Virginia, where they received Herbert Bengal Community Service Award and were a member of the Virginia Law Review's editorial board. So thank you, Wyatt, for being here tonight. We also have Mike Pruitt. Mike is a fair housing attorney with Housing Opportunities Made Equal of Virginia, which he joined in 2024 as a Powell Fellow. Mike previously served 8 years as a surface warfare officer in the United States Navy, deploying twice to the Persian Gulf before working as an analyst and team lead at the Office of Naval Intelligence. After leaving the military, he worked at the Urban Institute on rural workforce development projects before attending law school. During law school, he worked as a legal intern at the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division's Housing and Civil Enforcement Section and at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, in addition to a range of pro bono experience in LGBTQ plus issues, employment, housing, and more. He served as an editor on the Virginia Law Review and an executive editor of the Virginia Journal of Social Policy and the Law. Mike was also elected to the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors in 2023, representing the Scottsville District. In this capacity, he serves on various local boards, including the Albemarle County Broadband Authority, the Thomas Jefferson Regional Planning District Commission, and the Charlottesville Albemarle Transit Authority. Mike holds a bachelor's from Duke University, a master of policy management from Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. He and I were actually classmates, and a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. Thank you, Mike, for joining us. Just to give people a little bit of background about Equality Arlington, the host for this event. So we are a LGBTQ plus advocacy nonprofit based in Arlington, Virginia. We were founded in 2023, and we focus on fighting for protections and rights and benefits for LGBTQ plus residents throughout our community, both at the local level and at the state level. Doing events like this are important in times when people are anxious, they're afraid about their rights, especially as they see them being attacked across the country. And so we wanted to work with our partner organizations like Home and ACLU to bring you all the facts about your rights and protections, and have an open discussion about what the landscape looks like for folks today. So with that, I will turn it over to Wyatt for some opening comments.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Kellen for organizing this and Equality Arlington for organizing this event and for that really gracious introduction. I'm really glad to be here with all of you tonight. I know the reason probably many of us are joining is not um, positive, right? I mean, this is a very frightening time, but I think it's really important all the more important for us to be sharing spaces like this and sharing information and the ways that we can all be showing up in this moment. So I'll be really brief in kind of opening remarks because there's a lot to cover. A lot has happened in the last several months, which I'm sure folks in this virtual room are well aware. But I just want to say, again, I work for the American Civil Liberties Union Virginia affiliate. So we work specifically here in the Commonwealth. I'm really excited also for the opportunity to talk about what's going on in the state, which I think is very important, even as we're facing these federal onslaughts. Very important things happening here in Virginia. For folks who don't know, I think a lot of folks are familiar with ACLU, but always just like to ground us in that we are a multi-issue, nonpartisan organization committed to protecting the civil rights and civil liberties of all Virginians. And I think most folks who know about the ACLU think about litigation, probably especially right now, and it is true. We do file a lot of lawsuits. But we also do policy work. We do communications work, kind of the hearts and minds narrative work. We have an organizing team at the ACLU of Virginia. And a big part of the way we approach the work is like an integrated systemic approach to make lasting change. And I think that's all the more important in these moments where there may be anxiety about the courts and certain systems, and there are many tools and many ways that we can all show up in this moment. And I think that the ACLU is really striving to embody that. And then I guess the last kind of grounding thing I want to say, knowing that, again, this is probably something that all of us are well aware of, is that, this is a moment of crisis on many of the issues that we work on and for many communities. And, that this onslaught of dangerous attacks, I think that's particularly true for a subset of the issues and communities that the ACLU works alongside of. And that's really our immigrant neighbors and transgender Virginians and Americans. And I think that there's just a particular viciousness and pervasiveness of the attacks on those communities. And I want to ground us in saying that these aren't, like, I think when I say civil rights, civil liberties, these aren't theoretical, abstract concepts that are being teased apart, right? These are material threats to people's livelihoods and really their lives, right? The people's access to healthcare, their freedom to travel, in the case of our immigrant neighbors, right? Their freedom, their liberty, the ability for folks to obtain an education, housing, which I know Mike will share plenty about. So this is a really vital moment for all of us to think about how we are present and showing up for our LGBTQ community, particularly the trans and non-binary members of our community, and then also the rest of our neighbors. Like I said, our immigrant neighbors and other folks that are being impacted by the federal attacks in this moment. So grateful to share space with you all. I know we're going to dig more deeply into these topics with some questions from Kellen, and I hope we have a chance to hear from everyone in the room as well that has questions and comments. So thanks again, Kellen.
Thank you, Wyatt. Mike?
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here with y'all. I want to tell you just a little bit about Home and what we do, and then I will close with a few remarks. So Home is a nonprofit that focuses on fair housing. We are the only one that focuses on fair housing for the entire state of Virginia. And fair housing, that's a term of art, but what we're talking about is non-discrimination or discrimination work on the side of the good guys, right? We do that through a few different kind of avenues. One of them is we do mobility counseling for folks. We help actually place folks in homes that help them move into neighborhoods of opportunity. We do education. We do different types of counseling with home ownership, foreclosure prevention. We also do some policy work in the General Assembly. And lastly, we do litigation and investigations. The investigations piece is really important. This is kind of like doing, double blind secret shopping, but with housing, right? You have people posing as applicants for housing, going in with different characteristics, right? Like one white applicant, one black applicant, and seeing how they're treated differently in that experience. We then use that to inform some of our litigation, and then our litigation kind of informs some of our policy efforts. So we kind of try and, we have one issue, but we try and hit it from every single angle we can. I am one of the 3 attorneys we have that focus just on the litigation piece, as well as, and I'll touch on this later, but the administrative process that kind of mirrors litigation and can run parallel to it. I recognize that the threat that this administration presents is real and on everyone's mind, right? We schedule at home, we try and set up education and know your rights meetings across the Commonwealth, but it is not normal that we have people reaching out to us. Please come up. We are concerned. We want to hear about this type of discrimination. But I must confess, this is the 3rd such invitation that we received in as many months from a different organization across the Commonwealth. People are scared right now, and I don't think it's unfounded. In my personal life, I can say I attended an emergency wedding between 2 friends of mine who are trans, which is a really bleak pair of words to set next to each other, emergency and wedding. And I could have said to them, oh, I don't know that your particular concerns are under threat right now, but that doesn't help anyone, right? That doesn't make that very real sense of urgent fear, of justifiable fear, disappear. When I've had friends who are trans who didn't think to ask for their passport before the election, expressed to be concerned, who do I go to? What type of lawyer even is the person I should go to? And I have to say, you know what, this is such a novel issue. I don't know who you're supposed to go to. It doesn't help to say, but you'll still get a passport, probably. So I want to join Wyatt in saying, like, we recognize that the concerns people are feeling right now, the fears people are feeling right now, are justified and real. I do hope that at the end of this, our panel, we're able to give y'all a little bit of extra knowledge, a little bit of information about kind of how the laws of Virginia at least might provide a small modicum of extra protection and security. And at least with the knowledge of where we stand right now, you can go out and feel a little bit more comfort.
Thank you, Mike. And so for my first question, to kind of set the stage for the conversation, over the next 45 minutes or so, the Trump administration has released a number of executive orders attacking the transgender community. Additionally, federal agencies charged with protecting individuals from discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity have either quietly or loudly stopped their enforcement, while other agencies are actively seeking to erase the existence of trans and non-binary individuals. Where do things stand right now with the rights of LGBTQ plus individuals in this country?
Okay, this is a big one. I am going to attempt to do a high-level overview and not take all of our time. And then I really do want to encourage people that if there are things you want to hear more about, please ask questions of me and Mike at the end of the presentation, or drop them in the chat, or I don't know if there's a Q&A feature. But with that, I will say one last caveat is that this is a really rapidly changing landscape. I think this is being recorded, so I am going to say into the ether, this is information and guidance that represents our best understanding as of April 22nd, 2025. Please, if follow trusted partners like Equality Arlington, Housing Opportunities Made Equal of Virginia, ACLU of Virginia, ACLU National, other organizations to stay up to date, because again, things are changing pretty rapidly. I'm going to give you kind of a roadmap of how I'm going to do this overview. I want to first give like an executive orders 101, like what are executive orders that you keep hearing about? What do they mean? Then I want to do a really high level summary of the anti-trans executive orders that have dropped thus far, kind of highlighting the major ones, and then invite questions if there are ones people want to hear more about. Very quick overview of some of the high profile successful litigation challenging some of these EOs and where that stands and what it means for you. And then tease a little bit out of some Virginia specific context of how this is all playing out on the ground. And I know we'll dig into, Kellen will invite us to talk more about that as we go forward. So starting with Executive Orders 101, executive orders are not law. In a very nutshell, I will say executive orders are instructions to federal agencies to take action. They cannot immediately change regulation. There is a whole formal process for that requires notice and public comment. They can't change the law that's established by statutes and interpreted by court. EOs cannot do that. And EOs cannot change congressional appropriations. So Congress, what people call the power of the purse, money that Congress has said is going to be used a certain way. I'm going to give a big asterisk to that because we all live in the world and understand that anticipatory compliance is real and is happening, right? So everything I said is true. EOs don't change the law. Many of the EOs that have been issued conflict with law and our structure of government. And sometimes entities are doing what they say anyways, and it's hurting people, right? So I'm not here to gaslight you, but I am here to, as a lawyer, right? And I want to tell you the meaning of executive orders. They don't change law. They cannot make law. But to give you, I want to give you like a really quick example of this, and because Kellen said specifically about agency enforcement. So, for example, in response to the day one executive order that kind of attempted to define trans people out of existence, we see the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, which enforces Title VII about employment discrimination, just saying, we're going to stop enforcing or litigating cases, enforcing prohibitions on employment discrimination against trans people. We're not going to open any investigations into that. Okay, question whether that's legal, but the reality is that EO and anything the EEOC says cannot change the Supreme Court of the United States decision in Bostock v. Clayton County that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, that said discriminating against trans people is discrimination on the basis of sex and it violates Title VII, right? The EO just cannot change that. So one, EOs are not law. That's our first EO rule. The second is that like Virginia law remains the law. We're going to dig into this more in in detail in later parts in the presentation, but all of the protections for LGBTQ people under state law, like the Virginia Human Rights Act, the Virginia Fair Housing Law that Mike will talk about, those are all still in full force and still protect against discrimination in employment and public accommodations like school and healthcare and housing. And the EOs can't change that. And the last thing is a teaser that we'll talk more about is these are being challenged in court. So know that these EOs are being fiercely contested from many different angles, and they're not authoritarian edicts that can just stand, right? There are ways that people are pushing back on these, and that's happening in real time. So that's my 101. If there are more questions about EOs, happy to talk more about it. Okay. So that's the container they're using. They're rolling out all of these executive orders because they're fast. President Trump can do it unilaterally. What are some of the things we've seen? I'm going to highlight very quickly 5 major ones. So the day one executive order that came out on January 20th, I'm going to call it the sex discrimination executive order because I'm going to refuse to use their language on all of these EOs. So this is the EO that basically it did a number of things. I think the core feature is it defined sex. So the federal government is going to define sex, or the executive branch, as binary and immutably fixed at conception, right? There are only men and women, and whether you are a man or a woman is determined by, they don't use this term, I'm going to say your sex assigned at birth, because that's really what they mean, right? Whatever, and they pulled you out and were like, it's a boy, right? That's your sex forever. And it also banned what they titled federal funding for gender ideology, which basically is anything that says trans people are real. People can have gender identities and can change how they live, like what sex they live according to. And it also rescinded a bunch of other prior guidance documents that affirm trans people. So that sounds really like, okay, you're like, great, they did a philosophy EO on sex, like, but there are very real repercussions for that. Like what they named specifically impacts on identity documents, people that are in federal prisons, school systems, the workforce. So this was an EO that we knew would have major impacts. We just were kind of waiting to see exactly how. And we have seen major impacts almost immediately. Mike already mentioned passports, right? The State Department stopped issuing passports with affirming gender markers, with non-binary markers. The Federal Bureau of Prisons almost immediately cut off gender affirming care for people that were in their custody, started transferring trans women to men's facilities. It just had a really a whole myriad of really, really harmful impacts. So that was the day one EO. And from there, they've kind of gone on to more specific areas. Second one, I'm guessing people have heard of, is there was an executive order attacking gender affirming care for transgender people under 19. So note that that includes 18-year-olds, adults. It specifically said that no federal funds could go to medical institutions that were providing that care, including research grants. So remember what I said earlier about EOs not being able to control federal funding. This is being litigated. It also, it did a number of things we can talk about in more detail, but really just know it was attempted to create barriers for people to access gender affirming care, like hormone replacement therapy, puberty blockers for trans young people, that help them live in bodies that align with their gender identity. So trying to really insert the government into decisions between families and doctors about what's appropriate care. Third one was there was a military ban. This had some of the most egregious language in the EOs, which is a pretty high bar because they're all pretty terrible, but it espoused a policy that the adoption of a gender identity inconsistent with an individual's sex conflicts with a soldier's commitment to an honorable, truthful, and disciplined lifestyle, even in one's personal life. And basically said that by definition, people who are transgender are unfit to serve in the military, and ordered the Secretary of Defense to update medical standards to prohibit trans people from being in the military. Fourth, we saw a ending radical indoctrination in K through 12 schools. This is another attempt to use federal funding to basically coerce entities into doing things that are not required by law and in some cases are prohibited by law. It threatened federal funding for any public school that, again, promotes gender ideology, that promotes discriminatory equity ideology, kind of reaching for DEI there. Any teacher that, quote, unlawfully facilitates social transition, which they mean referring to trans students respectfully, allowing them to use appropriate restrooms, names and pronouns that align with their identity, and also requires prioritizing patriotic education. So, you know, these are anti-LGBTQ efforts, but they're tied into a lot of other political projects. And again, this directs the education secretary to develop a plan to implement those federal funding restrictions within 90 days. So again, remember, there's going to be a lot of contesting of whether these EOs can do this, because this is congressionally appropriated money, federal money for our local schools that the president is trying to give put new restrictions on. And the last one I'll mention, because it is probably the thing that they hammer on the most. It is, you know, very politically volatile, but there's an EO that purported to ban transgender women from participating in athletics. Specifically, it says that any school that receives federal funding, that they will be violating Title IX, which prohibits sex discrimination for schools that receive federal money, if they allow trans girls and women to participate in women's sports. I'll just put, I'm happy to talk about this more, but say that it clearly violates court decisions that have found that the reverse is true, right? So here in the Fourth Circuit in Virginia, there is a decision, BPJ versus West Virginia Board of Education, that found categorically banning trans girls from playing on girls' sports teams actually violates Title IX, right? Because that was a case litigated on behalf of a young girl, a middle schooler that had been on puberty blockers, never gone through endogenous elevated levels of testosterone, wanted to run track and cross country, and was just blanket banned just because she is a trans girl. And the court found that that violated her rights. So we have the Trump administration trying to like redefine that and flip it on its head. I'm only touching the surface. I know I've just laundry listed at you, but there are so many. There's EOs that mass rescind other executive orders that prohibit discrimination, EOs ending diversity, equity, and inclusion programs that are going to impact LGBTQ people. There's even an EO that critiques Biden for having Transgender Day of Visibility on Easter last year. So, I mean, they have gone ham on the EOs. There are so many. So I don't want to keep listing them, but again, if there are specific things, happy to talk with you more about them. But I want folks to remember that this is clearly a tool the administration is using with some success to harm our community. But these EOs do not allow President Trump and his administration to govern by edict. They cannot do that. And which brings me to legal challenges. So many lawsuits. We also cannot talk about all of them, but I want to name 3 that have been successful thus far, and I think may impact people on this call. And if you have questions about them, again, please put them in the chat. But I want to start with a late-breaking victory that happened on Friday. There is a case ORR v. Trump that challenged the State Department's application of that day 1 executive order to stop issuing affirming passports. Right now, if you're trans and you apply for a passport, it's very likely you'll get one back with your sex assigned at birth on it. So even if you've updated all of your other legal markers, they will say that, they're going to give you the ID according to that, definition of your sex defined at the moment of conception. So just this past Friday, there was what's called a preliminary injunction entered. That is when on the very early end of a case, the court decides it's really likely you're going to win. So we're actually going to give you some relief now on the front end while the case goes forward. So the court ordered the State Department to issue proper passports with the plaintiff's proper genders, including an X marker for some of the passports. So a non-binary, some of the plaintiffs, including an X marker. What I wanted to say is this relief for right now is just for those the named plaintiffs in that lawsuit, but this is a class action, what's called a putative class action. They're saying that there's going to be a class that includes all trans people who would like a passport or who need a passport. They just haven't had that class what's called certified yet. So if you are someone who is trans and needs an updated passport, you still want to hang tight, but I want to tell you that's really, really good news for you, because once the class is certified, they can expand that relief and potentially, the court may order that the State Department does that for all people. So passports, a W for our team. PFLAG v. Trump is another case that challenged the gender affirming care executive order. There was a preliminary injunction entered in that case as well, which impacts all young people, I think many of them going to medical institutions for this care, because the court said, you're very likely to win. We think that this executive order is not proper, and we're going to bar the Trump administration from terminating federal funding to hospitals that are providing this care anywhere in the country. If a hospital is providing gender affirming care to trans young people, the Trump administration cannot cut off federal funding for that reason. So that case is going forward, but early success there too. And the last one I want to mention is Talbot v. USA. That's the military ban challenge. It is I know people probably don't read legal opinions, but it is a beautiful opinion written by a lesbian judge out of the DC District Court. Just one of her quotes: the military ban is soaked in animus and dripping with pretext. I mean, she just rips them to say there is no evidence in the record that trans people cannot serve honorably in the military. It's a really beautiful opinion, and I think bodes really well for that challenge going forward. So more litigation to come, but I just want to say, these EOs, they are legally questionable, they are being challenged, and there is early success in many of these challenges. I actually probably want to stop there. Virginia specific context, and we can come back to very, very quickly. I want to remind folks that these EOs cannot change Virginia law. So depending on what you all want to talk about, we can dig into that. Very high level, gender affirming care remains legal in Virginia for all ages. That is true for minors as well. There are no restrictions on gender affirming care under Virginia law. The EO did not create any. If anyone here is a trans person that needs to update identity documents that aren't federal documents, like if you need a driver's license, your birth certificate, none of those rules have changed. We have self-attestation, which means you can just check a box at the DMV to get the driver's license that matches who you are, and the Trump administration cannot change that. So if you need accurate ID, please do that. Please go get a real ID. It's an easy process at the DMV. If folks want to talk about how to update your birth certificate, happy to do that too. I can also drop my email in the chat. Those things have not changed. So again, executive orders, limited in what they can do as far as redefining federal law, federal funding, and they're not touching our rights here in Virginia that we fought very, very hard for and still have robust protections under Virginia law. So that's my attempt at a speed table setting. I want to pass to Mike though, because I know he is much better positioned than I am to talk specifically about impacts on housing.
Thank you so much. So I don't have nearly as much to say because I don't have nearly as much to cover, but I am going to use that to go maybe a little in depth briefly on the specific concerns in housing. And to do that, I'm going to very briefly explain a bit of how like housing issues work. So I mentioned this, I alluded to this briefly, but when you have been discriminated against in housing, when you come in and you're maybe a same-sex couple and you try and rent and you think you're not being treated correctly, you're not being treated the same as a mixed-sex couple because of that, for example, or if you are afraid that as a visibly trans person you're being discriminated against in housing, there are really two main avenues that you can get that handled. The first one is probably kind of obvious to you, and that's suing, right? Just take them to court because they're not treating you right. The other option, which is actually what we will frequently say, advise people to do because it's frankly easier and cheaper, is filing in what we call an administrative complaint. And that's can be either through the Office of Housing or the Department of Housing and Urban Development through the federal government, or at the state level through the state. And very soon, thanks to some separate advocacy that I know Kellen MacBeth is involved in, hopefully through Arlington County itself, will be able to handle those complaints. But frankly, most people go to HUD because HUD is the office that people know, right? They're the housing people. That's who you send your complaints to. When you file a complaint through HUD, it can be processed without you having to hire a lawyer. They independently investigate it, and they can have basically a finding of cause that has a lot of the same effects of a actual piece of litigation. So this is really helpful for people with limited means, which is frankly a lot of people, because hiring a lawyer is expensive. That is all kind of important table setting because it helps us understand why what the Trump administration has done. One other piece matters. One other piece of table setting that I do want to briefly touch on. So Wyatt touched on Bostock, right? Bostock was a very important piece of legislation that was under Title VII, which is basically employment discrimination law. And it was a bundle of, I believe, 3 cases that found that basically when we say discrimination on the basis of sex, if you are discriminating against someone because they're a lesbian, then that means, oh, it's because of the fact that they're a woman who is also attracted to women, right? That is on the basis of sex. If you're discriminating against someone because they're trans, then you're discriminating against them because they are a woman, despite being born and assigned male, right? That it understands the idea of discrimination on the basis of sex as being obviously also inclusive of discrimination against queer people. That was a finding on 3 cases that related to employment law, but employment law and housing law share borderline identical language in their statute construction and have consistently throughout legal history been interpreted to kind of walk in lockstep in most regards. The same is also true of Title IX, which is how we got several key decisions in other jurisdictions, finding similarities there. This is important because we treat the decision in Bostock at home and previously in the federal government as expanding coverage to LGBT people under the Fair Housing Act, the Federal Fair Housing Act. And Biden issued an executive order to that effect that basically made it so that not only could you bring lawsuits under the Fair Housing Act, under federal law, but you could also begin a HUD complaint. You could have access to that administrative complaint process. The day one executive order has had the effect of repealing that executive order from Biden. That being said, it is deeply ambiguous because of how chaotic the administration has been. It is deeply ambiguous to people at HUD what the hell they're supposed to do about this. So there is actually guidance that has been directed that says that the individual regional level field offices have to make decisions about how they're interpreting that as applies to whether or not housing complaints on the basis of transgender status or sexual orientation, whether or not those. So what's happening is, frankly, most complaints that go through HUD that allege discrimination on the basis of LGBT status are getting dismissed, despite the fact that we would consider this to be clearly consistent with the existing case law. There is silver lining, as we'll touch on in a bit. There is Virginia law that kind of provides a helpful backstop to it. But that is one of the most immediate changes. We would still say, because again, Bostock hasn't changed, and we do treat that, and we do believe that those can walk hand in glove. You can still file a lawsuit in federal court, and you can also still file that alongside a Virginia housing law, which would make it so it's basically bulletproof. That is still available, but the administrative complaint process is valuable, and that's being foreclosed at the federal level. So that's an important element. One other thing that I want to talk about briefly is what we call the equal access rule. This relates to shelter care, as in like homelessness shelters. And one, I promise, last bit of quote table setting. We've talked about executive orders and how they're not law. And we've also seen very clearly they can be really changed at the drop of a hat, right? One president comes in, they immediately roll back previous executive orders. Something that kind of functions like an executive order, but has a little actual force of law and is frankly a little stickier, is a final rule. This is basically the executive order getting realized into kind of continuing direction that goes to federal agencies. And I say it's stickier because there's a very formal, created by a congressional act, the Administrative Procedures Act. There's a very formal and frankly time-consuming process for changing a federal rule. In 2012, the then Obama administration passed what's called the Equal Access to Shelter rule. And this requires that homeless shelters that are receiving federal funds must provide shelter to people based on their affirmed identity. Basically, it makes so that if you're receiving federal funds, you can't refuse to provide shelter to trans women, trans men. If you're operating a women's only shelter, you have to include them. You cannot segregate them out in a way that's inconsistent with their gender identity, because this was a problem that was occurring. So if they're receiving federal funds, they have to not discriminate on that basis. There has been what we would call a notice, or well, there hasn't even been a notice of proposed rulemaking. It has been said by the Secretary of HUD that they are going to issue a proposed rule to eliminate that. That would then still go through the whole time-consuming rulemaking process, but they are basically directing, again, kind of an inversion of that. Again, that is not the law yet. And until that goes through the whole rulemaking process, the opposite is still true, right? They have to continue providing shelter if they're receiving federal funds to trans folks. That does not stop, though, what Wyatt already mentioned, right? Preemptive compliance. The idea that some shelters are, HUD's already saying like, hey, can you show us your proposed new contract, even though they haven't initiated this rulemaking process. So something that we are keeping our eyes out for is any shelters that attempt to preemptively comply and change whether or not they are providing shelter and access to homeless trans folks. This is something that we're especially concerned about because, as we'll talk about, it potentially creates a troubling conflict of laws, and is deeply concerning because, frankly, like, it is hard to find a more vulnerable part of the U.S. population than homeless trans folks. And that is what our new Secretary of Housing and Urban Development has decided is their particular bugbear, the group that they most directly want to target. So those are kind of the most immediate concerns that we will, I'm sure, dig into some of these further.
Thank you, Wyatt and Mike, for those detailed explanations. I think, in this climate, as an advocacy organization, Equality Arlington, we've been working closely with you both to navigate the legal environment, understand these executive orders, what their potential impact is, and also, as we work with Arlington Public Schools, who's now under investigation by the Trump administration's Department of Education over their DEI and trans affirming policies. We just had a meeting with Virginia Hospital Center, encouraging them not to comply in advance with the executive order around gender-affirming care for trans youth. And we've been talking to a lot of other groups, businesses within Arlington County as well, and saying, you know, Virginia law still stands. These executive orders, they don't change anything. And also, please fight back, because I think that's something, you know, why it was really helpful to hear about the lawsuits, because I think what a lot of people have been seeing is a lot of organizations rolling over and just sort of saying, oh, we can't put pronouns in our emails anymore to do business with the federal government. Okay, we're taking those out. None of our employees, that happened at my company. We're no longer allowed to do that because the Trump administration said, we will not respond to any email that you send us if it includes pronouns in it. Absurd things. And so I think what we're seeing as advocates and as individuals is a lot of organizations just apparently complying in advance. And it can be disheartening if you're not as well versed in the number of legal challenges and people who are fighting back and who are saying, no, you can't do these things. And we're going to take you to court to prove that. I know we're short on time, so let's jump into our next and probably final question before, you know, we have a little bit of time maybe for folks to ask their questions. But the Virginia Human Rights Act protects LGBTQ+ individuals from discrimination in housing, employment, public accommodation, and education. What does that mean in practice, and how are those rights enforced? And I think this is sort of the crux, and why you had referred to this, and Mike, you as well, that regardless of what happens at the federal level, in Virginia, we still have these protections, and that's not going to change no matter what the Trump administration does.
Yeah, I can kick us off, and I'm going to be brief, so I'm surprised you. I think we can do more questions. So in 2020, there was a bill that was passed called the Virginia Values Act, and that amended both the Virginia Human Rights Act and the Virginia Fair Housing Law to explicitly prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. So you don't have to do the Bostock thing where Mike was explaining, like, discrimination on the basis of sex. You can't really discriminate against me as a trans person without discriminating me on the basis of sex. That's like impossible to do, because it actually just says you can't discriminate against me because I'm trans, because gender identity is protected. So it adds that for both, like in the VHRA, the Virginia Human Rights Act, which is public accommodations and employment, and the Virginia Fair Housing Law, which is housing. And again, the EOs don't change that. So in Virginia, it is illegal, for example, public accommodations like educational institutions, to discriminate against trans people. So when we have these EOs that are dropping about radical indoctrination in K through 12 and keeping men out of women's sports and all of that, like, they can't, like, one, again, they can't change federal law, but they certainly can't change our law here in Virginia that protects those trans students and LGBTQ students more broadly. So how do you enforce that? Very quickly, I want to say individuals can enforce that, and our attorney general should enforce that, right? So as an individual, what you would do, kind of similar to what I'm not sure if Mike mentioned this earlier, is going forward, but there's an administrative process for filing a complaint with the VHRA. You have to file a complaint first with the Office of Civil Rights for the Department of the Law. So that's a department under the Attorney General. It's a form that you can find online, but the important thing is to know you can't run right to court. You have to file this complaint with the administrative body. They conduct an investigation, determine whether they believe an unlawful discrimination has occurred. If they do, they can attempt what they call conciliation, conference, or persuasion. So basically, the AG can kind of try to make the actor that discriminated against you make it right. If not, they can give you a right to sue letter and then let you go to court. And if they don't finish their investigation and decide which way they think it goes within 180 days, you can just say, give me the letter. I'm going to court myself if you're not going to move on it. So again, individuals can enforce the Virginia Human Rights Act protection, even if we have an attorney general that doesn't want to protect LGBTQ people. And I will say, if we have attorney general who is values aligned and wanted to protect LGBTQ people in employment, in public accommodations, they also have the ability on their own to bring enforcement actions. If there's either a pattern or practice, so let's say it's a school system that is regularly discriminating against trans students, or if they decide it's an issue of public importance. So they're just like, whatever's happening should not be happening in the Commonwealth. It matters. It is contrary to our values. I, as the Attorney General, am going to step in and address this. So that's how the VHRA functions generally. If we have time, I'd like to come back and say there are some things I think could be strengthened about it, but I do want to say it's a tool people fought very, very hard for. And having those explicit protections, having sexual orientation and gender identity named in those laws, in our housing law, in our employment discrimination and public accommodations, is something that, again, as Kellen mentioned, is a robust protection that has not eroded. And it's really important that Virginians understand that and assert those protections when necessary. So Mike, I don't know if you want to say anything specifically about our fair housing law.
There is only one thing, and this is something I try and make very clear whenever I'm on a panel that has someone talking about employment law, because there's one very critical difference that if y'all are expecting to experience discrimination, worth making a note about. It would be on your test if we were testing y'all. So in employment law and other types of discrimination, you do need that right to sue letter. You have to go through the administrative process first. In fair housing and housing discrimination, you do not. You can do both in parallel, or you don't even have to touch the administrative complaint process. You can just go straight to court on your own. That is a thing that is really special about housing law and that is not shared by employment law. So I want to make sure that everyone's clear on that. The other thing is, otherwise housing follows the exact same process, right? I would in fact encourage people, and we encourage our clients who come to us first, is that it is right now, we often would, under normal circumstances, we would often tell people to file with HUD first, because there's frustrations we have with the Virginia Fair Housing Office. But right now, frankly, file with the Virginia Fair Housing Office because it will actually be heard. It will actually investigate claims on the basis of sex and LGBT status. And also, frankly, even if it's not on those bases, probably file with the Virginia Fair Housing Office because everything is chaos over at HUD right now because of the Trump administration. And I would add, you know what, I'm going to do you a solid here, Kellen, because I think the next question is kind of heavily answered by this. So I'm going to say it directly because I have Kellen's question sheet here too. Virginia is very, very lucky and in a great position. Not lucky, right? Hard work went into changing these laws. Virginia is a place where we actually do have these protections, and it's pretty freaking bulletproof, right? You can't argue that the law doesn't say the verbatim thing it says in Virginia law, and you can go into Virginia court with that all day long, and there's nothing the Trump administration can do about it. That is not true of some other states and localities in the Commonwealth or in the United States. And especially in Arlington, y'all have an even greater depth of protection. Y'all have an independent human rights commission that can also lead kind of administrative processes. They don't quite have the same degree of power as the Fair Housing Office at the state level, but they're working on it. And you also have, frankly, just a wealth of resources available in Arlington. And you have a government that cares about you. There's always places for improvement, but that does put Virginians and Arlingtonians in much better footing, and I hope that y'all can take some comfort in that.
Thank you both for that. Yeah, and appreciate the plug that, and Arlington is not the only locality in the Commonwealth that has local protections that mirror the state ones. Alexandria, Fairfax, there's other localities as well that have these. So there are options. I think that's the key takeaway that we've been trying to emphasize to the LGBTQ plus population in Arlington is that regardless of what happens at the federal level, we're still protected in Virginia, and that if you face discrimination from a business, a school, landlord, you're still protected, and you still have recourse available to you through the law to be made whole as much as possible. So I think since we only have 7 minutes left, I did see a question in the chat and I wanted to go to that. And then if we have enough time, I have a final question, but I think there was a question around passports. Wyatt, you may have already answered it in the chat. But
Yeah, I'm
from
actually
Novel
looking.
Rogers.
Maybe
Yep.
let me go in reverse order of how I answered in the chat. I want to say people have like detailed questions about identity documents. Please follow the Virginia LGBTQ Bar Association. It's a organization of LGBTQ lawyers and allies. We host name and gender marker change clinics around the state, help people update their identity documents. We've also been doing info sessions for folks. So if you have detailed questions, please keep your eye out. There's none on the calendar right now, but we are trying to do more of them. And then I didn't say this in the chat, so thank you for inviting, but I do want to remind people what I mentioned at that case, Orr v. Trump. Right now, that relief is just for those specific people that filed the lawsuit. But if a class is certified, so they say actually a whole group of people are impacted by this, and we're going to allow this lawsuit to go forward on all of their behalf, it may be that the State Department's rules right now change. That hasn't happened yet. So if you are a trans person that has a passport in your hand right now and it's not expired, and has an affirming gender marker on it, do not attempt to update it. It is very, very likely you would get it back with your sex assigned at birth on it. And I just want to make that really clear. That has not changed yet. Niall's question, which is a really good one, was really just practically like, how do they know that? What are they doing? Like genital inspections when you've applied to update your passport? Like, how do they know what your sex assigned at birth is? And it's, we don't have, like, discovery hasn't started happening in that lawsuit where they ask for information from the defendant. But I will say some things we know for sure. I can tell you I am a trans person. I have changed my designation on a passport. They have a record of that, right? They know what my gender marker was on the very first passport I have. They have records of the forms I filed to update that gender marker. And what's happening is they can see that in their system. And when you apply for a passport now, they just go back to what they assume was your sex assigned at birth. I'm not sure, and I don't think that the people litigating, the ACLU lawyers litigating this case know for certain, but there are other federal agencies that also have records of your sex. The most common, I think probably the one most likely that they would look to for your sex assigned at birth is the Social Security Administration. So you have a Social Security number, likely if you are if you were born in this country, if you're a citizen. There's not a sex on your Social Security card, but the Social Security Administration has a sex associated with your record. So for example, I've had to go to the Social Security Administration and update that, but they can still see historically the record of what my sex marker was with the Social Security Administration. So even if you update your state documents, there's a chance that the federal government has records they could use to determine what they assume your sex assigned at birth would be. But again, there are some, like, I know, very nuanced, detailed, like factual situations people may end up in, which is why I offer either coming out to one of those clinics, a name and gender marker change clinic, or coming to one of our info sessions where we can really dig deeper into that. But I think high level takeaway is please be cautious still right now, especially if you have identity documents that feel safe for you, federal identity documents in hand right now that aren't expired. Those are still valid. I should have actually said this too. I'll drop this in the chat. The State Department has explicitly said any valid passport will be honored through its expiration date, even if it's even if it has an X on it, even if it has a gender neutral marker, even if it's not your sex assigned at birth, that is still a valid document. So please hang on to that. Don't send that in to them and have them give you something that is not accurate and not safe for you. Lawyers are fighting really hard to make it help make it as well as we can to make it so that folks can get those documents, but we're not quite there yet.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from participants? Okay, hearing none. I know we have like 3 minutes left, but one final question if you guys have a really brief answer. So Virginia will have an election this year for governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and the House of Delegates. With potential changes in Richmond on the horizon, what legislative pushes for LGBTQ plus residents would you most like to see?
So I want to first say we've said this pretty directly, but the key law, especially in the realm of housing, is already there. Right? We are explicitly protected in Virginia. The main thing that in the realm of housing that we would be concerned about are the various ways that the administration is chipping away at different kinds of enforcement protection, right? So like there is a federal grant program that funds a lot of the work that home does that is under threat. And we already weren't doing enough fair housing, anti-housing discrimination work to begin with. So things that help either fund or expand enforcement operations, things that help localities get their own independent enforcement operations up to actually identify, investigate, and root out discrimination are things that would be a priority for us. And that I think would be something that Equality Arlington would be really well positioned to kind of advocate for moving forward. And I just want to, co-sign what Wyatt was saying previously. This is not a specific bill, but it is hard to overstate how critical the office of the Attorney General is, right? We're all excited about the folks who are running for governor because they're intensely charismatic, right? She's got perfect hair no matter what she's doing. It blows my mind. But if I were to tell you what office I think is the most important that is up for election this year, it would be the office of the Attorney General. Right? This is the person who is going to be on the front lines of actually standing up on behalf of Virginians when the Trump administration does illegal shit, which is frequently. And currently that office is asleep at the wheel. It is going to be such a game changer for how we vindicate human rights, civil rights, LGBT rights, to have a really passionate advocate in that seat. And it's going to also be very important in how we kind of resist this just deluge of crud coming from the chief executive of the country.
Wow, yeah, I could not agree more. I almost want to let Mike have like a mic drop at the end of that. Though I do want to add two really small things to say. And I know this was in the question, but to just reiterate, to like say it again, our entire House of Delegates is up for election. The governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. It is, I know people say this to you every year in Virginia. I'm so sorry. I'm going to say it again. It is such an important election. It is very, very, very important that we make sure folks get out and vote for folks who are values-aligned candidates who are going to, take care of all Virginians. I know this is a meeting of Equality Arlington for our LGBTQ community, but for our disabled students in the school system, for our immigrant neighbors, for folks of color in Virginia, it is just essential that we have a firewall against these attacks from the federal government. So please go out and vote for values-aligned candidates. As far as what I think for folks in this virtual space, things that are really important that can flow, that will happen after that election, there is an constitutional amendment that is being proposed to, there are three actually, we don't have time to talk about all of them, but relevant to this conversation. There is one to remove the definition of marriage as between a man and a woman that is currently enshrined in the Virginia Constitution. It has no force after the Supreme Court decision in Obergefell that struck down bans on same-sex marriage and guaranteed marriage equality. We live in a scary time, right? Where like court decisions seem less solid than they did previously. And I understand why people are thinking about, Mike mentioned emergency marriages. I understand why people are afraid of the protections their marriage would get. And what we can do at the state level to actually take action is to make sure we don't have that provision in our Constitution. We enshrine marriage equality so that if that federal guarantee goes away, we still protect everyone's religion or everyone's relationship here in Virginia. We need the House of Delegates to pass that again in 2026 for it to go on the ballot in November 2026 for people to vote on, to actually have the referendum. So really important we elect a majority in the House of Delegates that supports marriage equality. Then the second piece, I know that we've been talking about the Virginia Human Rights Act a lot, so it's weird to tag this at the end as an aside, but one of the unfortunate things our state courts have decided is that right now, individuals, private actors cannot enforce the VHRA against the government. They found that it did not do what's called waive sovereign immunity. So you can't go to court and sue your school board or your city council or a public college that discriminated against like professor, they're not able to enforce those non-discrimination protections because of these court decisions. So we think it's really, really important that the VHRA is amended and makes clear that when we say we're eradicating these forms of discrimination in Virginia, we mean everywhere. And that also means in our local and state government institutions, because those are not places where values contrary to those of the Commonwealth should be allowed to persist, right? So that's gonna be a really big priority for us in 2026, and I know we'll be collaborating with Kellen and others on that. So hopefully you'll hear more.
Well, I just want to say thank you again, Wyatt and Mike, for being here tonight and taking time out of your busy schedules and lawsuits to update us on this really helpful information about our rights and the rights of our community members. I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight to hear about it. I hope you learned something useful and helpful, hopefully reassuring. I know these are dark times and the attacks seem incessant, but we do have real protections in Virginia, in Arlington, and at the federal level, even if they're not being enforced or they're being turned on their head. So there is good news, and we want to make sure that people understand that if they do face discrimination, if their rights do come under attack, that there is recourse that they can take. So I would encourage you all to check out. I know we included in the link, Equality Arlington has a Know Your Rights guide on our webpage under our resource tab. Please check that out. Please, share it if it's helpful. And we have other events coming up. We have our anniversary party this Saturday at Freddy's Beach Bar at 5 p.m. So for those who are Arlingtonians, I encourage you to come out and celebrate with us our 2-year anniversary. But if not, we'll have plenty of other events going on throughout the year and a lot of advocacy opportunities for people to get involved and pressure our state leaders and local leaders to do the right thing and stand with the LGBTQ+ community. So with that, I want to say thank you all again, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening.